If you believe that ethics should determine law, who should be held liable for robot misbehavior? I'm Tanya Hall for ZDNet, and joining me is Ryan Jenkins. He is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at California Polytechnic State University. Welcome, Ryan.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
You've got a very interesting job talking about robots and ethics. In fact, you recently did a talk at South by Southwest titled "A Roboticist, Ethicist, and Novelist Walk into a Bar." Tell us about it.
Yeah, that talk was great fun. So that was the title, and that gives you pretty much the gist of it. We weren't at a bar. There was no drinking, unfortunately. I feel like I was misled on that mark, but it was a lot of fun. My two co-panelists and I discussed the way that science fiction portrayals of technology help shape public understanding and public discourse about emerging technologies, and the role that fiction can play in helping produce public discussions that are productive rather than ones that are bogged down in unrealistic situations or dystopias or things like that.
What are some of the examples of maybe some ethical dilemmas that you've already encountered when speaking to manufacturers that are making products, smart technology?
Well, here's a good one that comes from the case of autonomous vehicles. So autonomous vehicles are probably going to have to decide, at least in some cases, where they're going to direct themselves in the event of a crash. And this raises difficult questions. This raises classic questions of moral philosophy about how we ought to distribute the benefits and harms that result from our actions. This is a question that goes back 2,500 years or so. It's a question we've been thinking about for a while. And one manufacturer said, well, the answer to that is pretty easy. The car is going to aim for the object that is smaller. And I guess the assumption there was that that would do less damage to the car itself and risk less harm to the passenger of the car, that is the driver, if you will. But immediately you can see the kinds of problems that raises, because it also means that you might aim for a child instead of an adult. And once you bring philosophers into the conversation, the people that are trained to uncover a lot of these assumptions and really dig into both the assumptions of our views and the implications of our views, it helps illuminate some of these dilemmas that we might not have appreciated beforehand.
You're absolutely right. I mean, this is one of the biggest questions involving ethics and robots is around autonomous vehicles. So should robots or artificial intelligence be allowed to make the decisions about who lives and who might not?
I think they should, only because that's a very broad question. If I had to choose yes or no, I'd say yes, but it would be a qualified yes. One thing that I could say is that it's already happening. It's just happening, say, away from public view and public scrutiny. But robots are already, and artificial intelligences are already deeply involved in questions about the distribution of goods in society, the distribution of, say, government benefits, distribution of wealth. Most stock trades are already handled by computers. But when it comes to making life or death decisions, I think that there's a great deal of promise that robots and artificial intelligence hold out. The question is just making sure that we develop those technologies and design them in a way such that their benefits are shared equitably and that they don't end up creating other problems in the course of solving some of the problems that we have today.
What margin of error should humans accept then if robots are making the decisions? I mean, how much better do robots have to be to justify giving up human freedom and decision making?
Well, if you're looking for a nice, neat, quantified answer, a numerical answer, I probably can't give you one. And in fact, I think you should be suspicious of anyone that offers an answer like that. I mean, if I stood here and I said, they should be twice as good as humans, you might ask, well, why did I come up with twice as good and not 3 times as good, 3 times as accurate or 3 times as reliable? And there's really no non-arbitrary number that we can pick to answer that question, I think. So I think a better way of approaching that question is to say, what kinds of processes can we put in place so that the technologies that get developed, we have trust in the way that they're being developed so that our interests are being reflected. And we know that whatever kind of machines that they develop, they're going to be trustworthy and the kind of thing that we can put our faith in. If I have to give a very brief answer, if the question is how much better should they be than humans, I should say they should be as good as possible.
You know, back to autonomous vehicles, recently in Arizona, an autonomous vehicle hit and killed a pedestrian. And if you believe that ethics should determine law, who then should be held liable for robot misbehavior?
That's a very thorny question. And this particular case is difficult because so many of the details are as yet unknown. So it would depend, in this particular case, who should be held liable. It depends if Uber had a mistake in their programming. It depends if they had disabled some features of the car. There's reason to think that the pedestrian was also violating the law, that she was jaywalking. There's reason to think that maybe the driver would have been distracted. I mean, all of these questions come into account. So this particular case, I think, is not one that's going to be cut and dry. In the future, when we have cases of fully autonomous vehicles that are driving around, say, with no one inside, right, empty vehicles, so we can't pin the responsibility on the driver. And if we have a case where pedestrians are completely obeying the law, so we can't pin any blame on them, I can certainly see situations where the most reasonable and just outcome is to blame the manufacturers themselves that design these products and are responsible for testing their safety limits.
In Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, a law was passed that prohibits humans from harming robots. So should humans change or adapt to accommodate robots? I mean, what would Isaac Asimov say about that?
That's a really bizarre law. If that's the language of the law, that people should not harm robots, I might have some qualms with that choice of words, because I'd ask the question of what it means to harm a robot. I don't think you can't harm a robot in the same way that you can harm a person. You can harm it in the same way that you can harm a tree or a table or a rock or something like that. But you probably can't inflict harm on it in a way that's really morally loaded and morally important, the way that you would harm a human being or an animal. But that's beside the point, I think. They probably mean like you shouldn't vandalize or destroy a robot or something like that. I think that the reason why a law like that makes a lot of sense is because we have what philosophers call indirect duties to robots. Not duties to themselves, not duties like the kinds of duties that we owe to each other to keep promises and not harm each other, but the kind of duties that we have to property. So I shouldn't, say, vandalize your house. Well, why not? Well, I don't owe your house anything. I can't hurt your house in the way that I can hurt you. But you care about it. I've harmed you, right? I've harmed you indirectly, we would say, when I destroy your house or when I vandalize your house or something like that. So if we have duties to robots, at least for the time being, they're probably indirect duties like that. Now, as for how humans can adapt to robots, I think that we're certainly going to have to learn to integrate them into our lives. And I think that with a lot of the robots that we see being unveiled in the near future, if we're being careful and if we're being mindful, I think it's quite plausible that we'll realize that the benefits of having these robots justify the inconvenience or the changes in our behavior that they would require.
You talk a lot about the use of robots and the military. So I guess, is AI embedded in the military robot sophisticated enough to make ethical decisions on the battlefield?
Again, I think we have maybe the same kind of misperception that we have with autonomous vehicles. So the AI inside an autonomous vehicle is not a little person that's deciding where to steer and if they're going to steer towards, the group of 5 people or the group of one person, the one person. And the same thing is probably true of military robots. They have some specific tasks that they're being asked to carry out, identify this person as friend or foe, identify this incoming object as to whether it's a threat or not. And those are questions, we can evaluate the reliability of those capabilities with some pretty high mathematical precision, I think. So whether the AI is good enough is a question of whether it's trustworthy in carrying out that very narrow range of tasks. But I don't think yet at this stage that we're having AI make what we would recognize as moral decisions about who deserves to die or who ought to die.
I mean, do you think that we'll ever be at a place where a robot can discern an enemy combatant compared to a child or a bystander?
That's a great question. It's really complicated. I have some trepidation. I have some anxiety when I consider that kind of future, as I think a lot of people do, and I suspect most people do. I think there's some polling on that suggests most people are worried about that. And for lack of a better term, the problem is that for the time being, robots lack what we might call common sense. So the process of determining whether someone is liable to be killed is not just a question of whether they're wearing a uniform, right? Because even someone in a uniform could be trying to surrender. And if you kill them in that case, it becomes a war crime. Even someone in a uniform could be injured. They could be out of combat. And again, killing them is a war crime in a case like that. So the task that's before us in developing military AI that's capable of discerning innocence from people who are combatants is tremendously complicated. And we have a mistaken habit of thinking that it's a simple question of dividing the world into two neat categories, people that are liable to be killed and people that are not, when in reality, the task is much more difficult than that. And it seems to me far beyond the ken of contemporary AI.
Well, we're definitely living in a world that's going to have more and more robots. And I think the conversation around ethics is going to be more and more important. I really appreciate your time, Ryan. If somebody wants to connect with you, maybe they want to check out one of your books or find out how to take one of your classes, how can they do that?
Well, you can search for me, Ryan Jenkins at Cal Poly. I'm also on LinkedIn, and I'm also on academia.edu.
All right. Well, I will do that. And, if you want to find me or more of my interviews, you can do that right here on ZDNet or Tech Republic, or maybe find me on Twitter. I like to tweet at Tanya Hall Radio, or find me on Facebook by searching for The Tanya Hall Show. Until next time.